Hi, I'm here with Mike Ertel. He is the Managing Director at Legacy M&A Advisors. He is also the co-chair of the Alliance and Merger and Acquisition Advisors Campaign for Clarity. Mike, can you please tell us about the AMNAA's Campaign for Clarity?
Absolutely. The Alliance of Merger and Acquisition Advisors for over 10 years has been concerned about the issue of proper licensing for people who do M&A transactions, people who advise typically privately held companies who are buying or selling another company. And about 7 years ago, we engaged an attorney to help us work with regulators and now legislators to clarify and simplify when does an M&A advisor need to have a securities license.
And so there's a bill in front of Congress right now, H.R. 2274, and it's meant to reduce regulatory costs on the sale of privately owned businesses. Can you give us some background on the current regulations that are involved in selling a privately owned business and tell us a little bit more about the bill?
Sure. Currently, the sale of a business can be regulated by both state laws and federal laws. In the case of many states, an advisor to the buyer or seller needs to have a real estate license. In some cases, in some states, they need to be registered with the securities commissioner in that state. And if the transaction morphs from being a pure cash or business assets transaction, and by that I mean if it includes an earnout, if it includes a seller's note, if it involves the sale of a part of the company rather than 100% of the company, all of those scenarios are securities transactions, and in that case, both state and federal securities laws apply.
And so how will this bill help protect buyers and sellers?
Well, currently, if a buyer or seller are advised by an intermediary who is not securities licensed, and the transaction morphs to a securities transaction, in many cases, the buyer and the seller could be subject to rescission, which means that within a period of time, within the statute of limitations, either party to the transaction could say, I just don't feel like I got treated fairly, or I think I made a bad deal, or I think I made too much, or I didn't get paid enough, and they could file a lawsuit to rescind the entire transaction and get all of their money back because the transaction could be illegal if the intermediary was not licensed to do a securities transaction.
And so this bill is going to help avoid that.
Exactly. This bill directs the SEC to clarify when does an intermediary have to be licensed and when do they not need to be licensed. And we're effectively requesting an exemption that if an intermediary is engaged in facilitating the sale of a privately held business and the intermediary is not holding the funds, he's not holding the securities, and he's not raising capital from passive investors, he or she shouldn't need to be securities licensed. And to this point, we've gotten a very favorable reaction from legislators, and we've frankly had some very candid conversations with state and federal regulators who agree that clarification and simplification is needed here.
And now, if this bill is passed, how would that exemption process work?
The bill would require the Securities and Exchange Commission to issue a rule, and I'd have to get into the details of the bill to tell you some of the specifics of that rule, but it directs the SEC within a period of time to issue a rule that would effectively exempt M&A advisors who don't hold funds or don't hold securities and don't raise capital from passive investors, to exempt them from FINRA membership and from FINRA regulations. If they're involved in larger transactions, they would still need to register with the SEC, but it would be a fairly simple registration, what we call a notice registration. If the transactions were small enough, the bill also directs the SEC to create an exemption even from registration for M&A advisors and business brokers who are engaged in smaller transactions.
How small would the transaction have to be?
That has not been defined in the legislation. We've left that up to discussions with the regulators once the bill is passed. But it would probably be large enough to exempt almost all Main Street transactions.
Sure. And now, what does this mean for private equity firms?
Well, I would think that private equity firms would be greatly relieved with the passage of H.R. 2274 because currently they're very active buyers of these small to medium-sized privately held companies, and they frequently work through intermediaries that bring them these deals that are not securities licensed, and so in those cases they are vulnerable to having those deals rescinded. And I would think that it would be a very uncomfortable day when the general partners of a private equity group were facing a rescission suit and having to explain to their limited partners that they had used all of their money and they'd invested in this transaction, but that they were now going to have to give all of that money back.
Sure. And Mike, I have one last question for you. So I'm curious about some of the challenges that you faced bringing this bill in front of Congress.
Well, it's taken us a long time, primarily because we initially thought we could do this simply working with regulators. And literally we have been working with regulators at the state and federal level for 7 years and through a couple of different administrations. And we've really not encountered anyone who thought this was a bad idea. The problem we've encountered was it's just not a big enough problem that the SEC could turn its full attention to solving this problem when they were dealing with the financial meltdown and the Bernie Madoffs and the failure of Lehman Brothers and so on. So it's just never been acted on. And we went to the legislature, we went to Congress, asking them for some help because it appears that the SEC only has time to work on those things that Congress directs them to work on, and even they're years behind the deadlines that Congress set for them to fix some other problems. So we've really gotten a very favorable reception from the congressmen we've met with. We're now working through our members to reach out to U.S. congressmen and senators nationwide and alert them to the issue and ask them to support this bill. So it's very, very early days, but the reception so far has been very warm.
Great. And now, Mike, what can our viewers or readers do if they're interested in taking part in helping to get this bill passed?
Well, they can contact me, and between you and I, we'll figure out a way to make it easy for them to get my contact information. And I can assist them in providing them with a copy of the bill, with a one-page briefing document that we've used to educate legislators about the bill. And they could then write their congressman and their senators and ask them to support the bill. They could help in other ways, but we can talk more about that as they contact me for more information.
Sure. Well, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to educate us on this bill. And if you're interested in learning more and connecting with Mike, go to fundology.com.